A note on the word release. I use the word, when I use the word release, I'm really referring to a mechanism or a vehicle by which one plans, develops, tests, deploys, delivers software to their customers. And I say here that release is the enterprise problem because there tends to be a higher level of complexity that comes with large enterprises. So this technology is everywhere. So large enterprises have multiple sites, multiple teams, multiple environments, multiple tools that they need to orchestrate in a streamlined manner that can really kind of get their products out the door faster so that they can have the effect that they want on their customers. So ARO can be one of the biggest challenges that enterprises face, especially these days where you're expected to release constantly, practically. So I defined release kind of as a vehicle on the last slide, and sometimes in my role as a solutions engineer, I visit customers, I visit prospects, and I help advise them on solutions they can take to ease some of their pain points. And some of the stuff I see in these enterprises reminds me of my first vehicle in its last years. This is a vehicle that the defroster didn't work. I live in Colorado, so I couldn't drive it in the winter when there was any condensation in the air, or I'd have a glassed over windshield. The AC didn't work, so I couldn't drive it when it was more than 90 degrees in the summer, because I'd show up at work just covered in sweat. The gas gauge didn't work, so I had to use the trip odometer. And if I forgot to reset that, then I just had to guess how much gas I had in the tank. The gear shift didn't work. It was off by 1. So I had to put it in reverse just to park it. And there were several other things about that vehicle, but I didn't have money at the time, so I just kept driving it. All of these things I was required to know just to get to work. So a lot more things about my car that I should have had to know about these risks, these hoops I had to jump through to mitigate those risks so that my car wouldn't fail on me and leave me stranded on the side of the road. So I see this in different enterprises, unfortunately, where the release is kind of like a dying car. So I'm going to cover an evolution or a journey of maturity as far as improving that and getting to a better place, along with some of the benefits that you can gain and some practices that you can put into place, and then finally just how to get started. So going down that journey, the first stage or milestone or whatever you want to call it is of course the one that has a lot of manual process, right? So this is the one with encyclopedia-thick run books with hundreds of steps that have to be performed sequentially in a perfect order, which is never something you should have a human do if you need it to happen repeatedly. And so because of this, release processes tend to be riddled with failure and inconsistencies, and sometimes resulting in these 100-person conference calls where you're basically a hostage because they don't know the root cause. You don't have that visibility into the root cause and into who's responsible for it, and more importantly, who you need to rely on to actually fix the issue. So it's a slow process, and it's a very frustrating place to be, and it can discourage you from really wanting to release faster, which is exactly what your enterprise probably needs. So the first reaction you probably, most people will have to this is to say, okay, I need to automate. So what's the quickest, cheapest way to automate? That's usually just writing scripts, right? So you can do that pretty much immediately. You can do it for free, and it provides value. I think every company that does software has a lot of scripts. So it definitely has its place. I mean, when performing certain checks, when you need to push some files around, run some background utilities and things like that. But the danger really comes when you overstretch what scripts are meant to be about. They're meant to do these little utilities to help your overall process. But when you start just tacking on functionality to some automated script that you have, and it just keeps growing and growing, and you say, I've automated this, I'll just add this piece, or I have a script that does this, so I'll add another script that does that, and then I'll have this one script call this other one because I want it to be more modular and things like that. But before you know it, it's 10 years later, and your set of scripts is just like a ball of spaghetti. It's like daisy chaining this very brittle code that everybody's afraid to touch. And you're maintaining this as your portfolio of applications evolve. So you have to keep adding new checks to cover new workflows, new conditions, new edge cases, and things like that. And so it really feels like a ticking time bomb. So so usually one of two things will occur, or two of two things. One, the author of the script might get hit by a bus, or they might retire. And the second thing is you might have to do some kind of digital transformation, which is becoming increasingly necessary these days if you want to kind of maintain your market share. And what happens if both of these occur simultaneously? So you have this big initiative in your enterprise to undergo some kind of digital transformation, and the author or stewards of your script are uncomfortable by this initiative, and they just say, I'm out. and they're gone, and you have to learn as much as possible in the 2 weeks before they leave, because it's now you who's in charge of maintaining not only maintaining these scripts, but modifying them in half a dozen different places, a suite of scripts, without actually having any negative side effects. It kind of goes back to that car. Suddenly you're driving that car I was just describing, but you don't know what happens when I go over 30 miles an hour in that car. So good luck with that. It's a better place to be than the last than the first level of maturity, but it's still part of the journey. So there is an easier way to do all of this, and the next phase is one where you model out the different components of your release such that building your workflow is just a matter of hooking up these components, and modifying your workflow is just a matter of swapping out the pieces as needed. And in this way, you're not enlisting the bomb squad to tweak some very brittle scripts. Instead, you're taking advantage. You're building reusable components that you can use in other projects and other teams within your organizations. And the more you use these components, the more of a sense of reliability, predictability that you get in terms of the outcomes when you run these. So these are just a couple of the different benefits that you can get. In addition, I've listed some others here. I sometimes refer to these benefits as the ilities, the visibility, maintainability, traceability, flexibility, et cetera. The more of these ilities, the more these benefits that you are seeing inside your organization, the more time you probably have to innovate on what your company is actually about, what your job is actually to do. And the more you can put some space between you and your competitors. And otherwise, if you don't really have any of these, you're really just kind of falling behind, because you're always fighting fires, you're always playing defense, you're playing catch up. You can have the best soccer players in the world and put them all on one team, but if they're all playing defense, then the only way you can score is that magic kick you see sometimes where the goalie just kicks it across the whole field and bounces over the other goalie's head. But that shouldn't be your strategy for release. So you want something that's more reliable. So how do you go about creating this model-driven approach to your release orchestration? Before you can do anything, you really just kind of have to understand it all. And so, this shouldn't look new to anyone here. We all whiteboard regularly within our companies. It's a good it's a good way to kind of share knowledge with other folks and get on the same page about things and really just capture what's in everybody's head and decide on a plan going forward. So this is one of the first things that I will personally do when I go into an organization to talk with them about their pain points and where they want to go, where they want to get to in the future. And so capturing your process and all the nuances that take place is a great step toward transitioning into something like this. This here is a sample scaled down pipeline and electric flow, which is our application release orchestration platform. In this pipeline, you can see some of the same kind of stages that you would have in a whiteboard that you have, including the different automated gates and manual gates that take place between each of these stages. And the idea usually is each of these stages maps to a progressively higher environment that you want to promote your code through as you get more confident toward releasing toward prod. And each of these stages will consist of whatever tasks that are intended to satisfy the needs of that particular environment, whether those tasks are to call functionality that you've defined in-house, that you've defined elsewhere that you want to reuse, whether it's to call third-party tools as plugins and bring in that data, whether it's to run things in parallel or serially, depending on how much you can streamline in your process, or whether there are certain conditions that determine whether these tasks are to run. So a best practice here is to first kind of lay out your overall pipeline, even if a lot of it's just stubbed out and it's all blanked out, because right off the bat you start giving people visibility. They can share this visibility and kind of start collaborating with each other as far as what pieces to work on first, and then basically just pick a piece and make something work, and then work left or right as is needed iteratively, so that you can establish quick wins within your organization. Because the more quick wins you establish, the more additional buy-in you can get from other people who might be resistant to change and whatnot. Because I think, as we all know, culture is the hardest part of transformation when it comes to instituting change. So in time, this pipeline that starts out just as this skeleton or this stub can become a template for these very people whose buy-in you need. And then with that template, you can enforce standards that your organization has to follow for compliance reasons, and bubble up the most pertinent data for your organization. So, with all of that said, what is it that you want to model is kind of the next question that comes to mind. And what we at Electric Cloud generally recommend is starting at the highest level. So it's basically what, where, and how. What is it that you're ultimately trying to release or deploy, and what makes this up? So this is usually an application and all the artifacts, which basically just packages of code that comprise that application and its dependencies and things like that. Just modeling that out at the high level, and then subsequently, where do you want these applications to go? If you can magically just have them in a certain location. So the answer to this isn't just I want it to go to dev or prod or QA. It's what does that consist of? So this might be some heterogeneous mix of physical, virtual, containerized locations on-premise or in the cloud that you need to kind of hook together to your application when you want to do your deployments. And finally, the how. This is, of course, you got your what and you got your where. Now you need to define the process by which you place your applications on your environments. So these are your application deployment processes for deploying a single application to a single environment. These are pipelines when you want to deploy a single application to multiple environments. And then finally, releases when you have a bundle of applications that go together that you want to push out into the world through multiple environments. So equally important to ask is how to model. So returning to the whiteboard of our value stream, what happens when you spend all this time creating this perfect whiteboard? It captures all the relevant information, and people agree on it and everything. The next thing that happens is someone usually just takes a photo, they'll upload it onto the system, and they'll maybe pull up a visualization tool, Visio, Draw.io, Microsoft Paint, and they'll work on a prettier diagram of your entire value stream, and then they'll share it with others. They'll circulate around. People will tweak it, and then finally it'll just kind of get dropped into some design documentation that you have, and then that's a place to be used as a reference for the folks who are implementing the different pieces of your release process. But what happens is they take those pieces and then they go to their siloed teams and then basically they start writing scripts. So you're back at that second level of maturity. So there is a better approach to this. Whereas if imagine you've done your visualization, you've created your diagrams, and you're actually able to run these visualizations now. So imagine you can click on your pipeline that you've whiteboarded out, and then it starts running, and all the individual tasks that you define start running on their own. And you can drill down to individual, to the granular data that gets produced by these tasks and things like this. So that's where Electric Flow and other ARO platforms. If you guys have probably heard of ARA in the past, application release automation. That was a term by Gartner, and they recently changed it to orchestration because it's really more than just automating. It's around orchestrating multiple environments and all the different tools that you integrate with, all into something that's a lot more maintainable. So this is where Gartner says things like ARO platforms are the best method for solving this release problem, really. So if you use an ARO platform, which basically can run these models for you, in addition to the what, where, and how, you're now getting the who and the when. So who ran my application deployment, and when did it happen, and you can keep track of that and use it for traceability purposes. Doing all of this gives you a lot more of those benefits, such as visibility, flexibility, speed, reusability, and things like that. So, speaking of the who and the when, another best practice, a good thing to think about up front when you're really kind of modeling out your release process is compliance and governance. So, the earlier that you think about role-based access control, for example, the less likely it is that you'll get caught off guard months later when you realize there's some security risk because you were too lax in your security protocols. And now you need to redesign all the different roles involved and the people in those roles. And that's ultimately just going to disrupt your overall process and make your vehicle stutter a little bit. So in addition, so when it comes to audits, nobody likes audits. So auditors really just care about two different things. They care about intent and they care about evidence. If you are modeling out all of these actual pieces of your process, then the pipeline model itself can show a lot of the intent, because you're saying, I want to go to this stage, and this stage, and this stage. This guy approves this, and I want to continue. And within each of these stages, I'm performing these tasks and all of this. So just the pipeline definition itself goes a long way by showing the intent as far as your intent on following the standards that you put in place as a company. And then the evidence piece comes when you actually run these things. So if you run a pipeline, you're able to say things like, the QA manager approved of a handoff to prod after testing these 3 versions of these 3 applications. last night at 5 p.m. Like, you can see all of that on one screen by simply pulling up historical runs and things like that. And it's the thing that really makes auditors happy. And it's also something that's good and beneficial for you, because the more visibility you have, the more empowered you are to move faster and make decisions, whether things are going well or whether things are going wrong. So the more visibility, the better, the faster you can move. So I touched upon reusability earlier when I was talking about the high-level modeling out of apps and whatnot. But I wanted to talk a little bit at a deeper level, because it's one thing to have a model that you can reuse here and there. But if that model, say an application, for example, has processes attached to it that are, they make a lot of assumptions about what your desired workflow is, what your inputs might be. Maybe they don't even give you the option to enter certain specific inputs. Then you might have a model that's actually too strict for realistic use. If, on the other hand, you replace those assumptions with runtime parameters, and you replace the hard-coded values that you may have with variables that are computed, whose values are computed elsewhere in your system based on some logic that you've defined, then you can really work towards having a model or a set of models that can act as templates for whole suites of applications, instead of one model per application or one model for a couple of applications. So this ultimately gives you fewer things to maintain if you really kind of templatize and parameterize your models. And finally, from that you can place these templates inside of self-service catalog items, where you can increase the simplicity for the folks who are not really authoring or defining anything. All they want to do is really run something or create something. So they click a button, enter a few parameters, and then boom, they've got a release with all your different compliance checks and all kinds of things like that. And so this is especially useful, self-service catalog type functionality, when you're a large enterprise and you need to enable onboarding at a much higher scale, and you might need to spin up 1,000 applications very quickly based on some list of data that you have somewhere. So that's where things like this can really accelerate your process. So taking this kind of approach and using an ARO platform doesn't mean that you have to give up the tools that you love. We've seen in the expo booth, there's all these different vendors, and they all have really good products that are very specialized in one particular thing, and you shouldn't have to give up that power and give up the data that it produces simply to adopt such a platform. So incorporating these applications, these integrations as plugins seamlessly into your overall process can allow you to use tens or hundreds of tools within your different processes without having to, say, after a run, go bounce around Jenkins, Jira, and all these things to verify that certain things have occurred as you think they have, because these kinds of tools also bring in the data from these third-party tools, and now you have a centralized location of all this data from all these tools, and you can really do a lot of stuff with that data. It really gives you the power to do. It basically saves waste, because if you're bouncing around all of that time, you can have a leaner process. So this is great for not only bubbling up relevant data for particular runs of a release and whatnot, but also it's good for capturing metrics at a higher level and an aggregate level. So you can build things like, you could display these things and build these really nice dashboards, because now that you have all this data in your system, you can visualize it such that you can recognize any trends that are taking place. You can compare trends across different teams and whatnot, and really kind of identify what some teams and some projects are doing really well and where others can improve. And you could really share the innovation that other teams have as far as releasing their products and deploying their products. So this visibility we strongly feel is kind of a prerequisite for making better decisions, because how do you improve anything if you can't actually visualize where you are in the first place? So having customizable dashboards that you can build on your data can really accelerate you just that further bit. And if your dashboards is built off of data passed from your models, then if you change out the underlying technologies of, say, your applications or your environments, but you keep the models in place, then you don't have that disruption of being able to visualize what you're doing, because your dashboards are still attached to your model. So it really allows you to have that kind of flexibility. And finally, like after you've accumulated enough historical data of your releases and whatnot, you can actually start looking forward. With machine learning algorithms and AI and things like that, you can actually start looking forward and trying to identify future risk that will put your releases at risk before you actually even begin a release process for a particular product. So we talked about model-driven approach to ARO, what that's all about, and the benefits that you can get from it. But where do you start? I mentioned before that you can have a kind of a skeleton of your release pipeline, and you start in one place and work iteratively toward that. But what I would recommend is if you really want to speed up adoption, start in the place that can give you the most value and benefit. And those terms, value and benefit, they're kind of relative terms. They don't really mean anything without an opposite. So like, where am I going to get the most value in changing something? Probably the place where I'm feeling the most pain. So that's usually an ideal place to start, because if you can change that fast and turn that into something that's less painful, then you could really kind of diffuse others' resistance. Turn your naysayers into your biggest champions. So as Jez Humboldt's famous quote, if something hurts, do it more frequently and bring the pain forward until it's not really a problem anymore. So, in conclusion, if you do this right, you will get boring outcomes, and that's a good thing. Like I want my commute to work to be boring, because if it's not boring, then something bad probably happened. Ran out of gas, car broke down, got in an accident, something like that. And when it comes to releases, boring kind of translates into, and I'll just repeat what I said last year, decreased time to market will become the norm. All hands on deck meetings any hour of the day will become a thing of the past. Onboarding apps and swapping out technologies will become more trivial. And finally, continued growth in your business will become expected, because you're not spending all your time struggling to get your product out of the door, throwing all these Hail Marys and hoping someone comes down with it in the end zone. Instead, you're focusing on your actual core competencies of your business. So that's all I've got, and thank you for listening. Any questions?